Good afternoon. On behalf of Engineers Australia, I'm delighted to welcome you all to our Thought Leaders series, exploring design innovation and focusing on the iconic Melbourne Connect project. My name is Amanda. Firstly, in keeping with our custom, Engineers Australia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land and recognises their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to their cultures and to elders past, present and emerging. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that today's webinar is being hosted with Engineers Australia's long-standing industry partner, Austral Bricks. Austral Bricks has a proud history of brickmaking spanning over 100 years. Founded in 1908, Austral Bricks is Australia's largest, best known and most innovative glazed brick and paver manufacturer. The company has a well-established national presence with manufacturing and sales facilities in every state. It has long been at the forefront of product innovation and efficient, sustainable production. Today, we will hear from two speakers, followed by a live audience Q&A session. And I encourage you to send questions through to our speakers via the YouTube chat box along the way.
Throughout the past 110 years, the face of building materials has continued to evolve. We're here for a lifetime of living. This is Brickworks. More than brick, and more than just building products, we are a foundation for today's lifestyle and a leader for today's style. We manufacture a wide range of building products like no other. Local and international innovation, sourced from around the world to exceed customer expectations. Distinctive and luxurious products, beautiful products that stand the test of time. Building inspiration and innovation with an unmatched standing of style. This is Brickworks.
I'd now like to welcome our moderator for today, Tim Mumford. Tim is an engineer and project manager with nearly 20 years of experience in both the public and private sector. Tim has an MBA and is a chartered Eng Exec. Tim's experience includes offshore drilling, large mining, minerals and metal projects, management consulting, asset management, and state and federal government infrastructure. Tim is passionate about the need for continuous improvement of major projects with an emphasis on technology, digital and data. Tim is the Director of Digital and Innovation at Becker. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and welcome again to our viewers. Womanjayaka. My name is Tim Mumford. I'm the Director of Digital at Becker, and I come to you from Melbourne, the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd like to welcome our first speaker today, Hazel Porter. Hazel joins us from Woods Bagot and is a leader in design, sustainability, and construction innovation for the built environment. Hazel collaborates with a range of stakeholders, engineers, facade specialists, to drive towards human-centred architectural design that is informed by context, physics, costing, and most importantly, buildability. Hazel leads projects and has done so for about 18 years. And architectural and master planning are her bailiwick, and a major range of diverse projects that she's got under her belt. Hazel challenges conventional and technical boundaries and working with clients and local stakeholders to understand their brief needs as well as their requirements across the end-to-end life cycle of each project. Hazel is an innovative problem solver and she tests and retests bounds, technical and otherwise. Hazel is a Woods Bagot design leader on the Melbourne Connect project, a purpose-built ecosystem really, for researchers, industry, governments, entrepreneurs and students, as well as the supply chain, as you'll come to see. Woods Bagot is a leader in architectural design, working across the built environment, and working with Lendlease, University of Melbourne, Urbanist, and Hayball on this such an important project completed this year. Please join me in welcoming Hazel Porter.
Hi, I'm Hazel Porter and I'm a principal architect with Woods Bagot in the Melbourne studio. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this Engineers Australia Thought Leaders session today. I'm currently in Melbourne and I'm speaking to you and acknowledge that the Wurundjeri people are traditional custodians of the land in which I am today and which the project is located. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So proximity and density are typically key to architectural propositions that are colloquially called these innovation precincts. So with the specific Carlton context in mind and a complex brief that we had to cater for both the public and the university, our approach to the design required a number of integrated and unconventional solutions that challenged almost all aspects of the project, from the brief to the planning process, the workflows and design documentation, through to construction techniques and the solutions that we came up with. So it's a process that we undertake in each and every one of our projects to approach each of these challenges anew. And by creating Melbourne Connect as this purpose-built innovation precinct, it brings together world-class researchers, government, industry partners, startups, higher degree students, artists, Science Gallery of Melbourne. And look, we've made a place with a connection that the architecture is actually trying to promote this at almost every opportunity. So our sort of description of innovation precincts is sort of next level uber mixed use. And by their nature, they're proximity driven collaboration places. So in order for us to make this place for collaboration, it's really made by collaboration. And our collaboration with the facades team was a particularly engaging one. Not to leave out all of the other collaborative partners that were along for the journey, this is just a very small selection of the people that we worked very closely with throughout the project. So to tell you a little bit just of the background and the genesis of the idea and how we actually constructed this place that is one of the only innovation precincts in the whole of Australia. It does sit just off of campus, just outside of the CBD, near the University of Melbourne. And so it's one of a small cluster of buildings that are sitting just in the suburb of Carlton. And as I mentioned, it's just off the traditional campus, and it's a site that has had a pretty robust dialogue with the surrounding context. It had a particular scale that was quite unique in Carlton. And look, it's been a site that's got an incredibly complex history. Since 1856, it's been a site of ongoing dedication to women's health and innovation in women's health. So, and then that's both in science and wellbeing. So it's a place of continuous learning with a lot of groundbreaking research happening here. So from the outset, the key design principles that we set for ourselves included the intent to deliver a really high quality built form that connects key land uses with really great amenity. So we resolved a built form that reflects the strategic importance of the precinct with really clear and demonstrated innovative precinct-wide ESD initiatives. So we also wanted to create an enhanced public realm and open space, which all of the program could connect. And we took cue from places like the old quad on campus at the university, so that connection back to the institution as a place of knowledge was still recognisable. So when we went through and approached the built form and investigated retaining the existing hospital buildings and trying to adaptively repurpose them, it became pretty clear to us that this wouldn't have facilitated any of the intentions to do with the brief and the aspiration that the university had. So we conceptually flipped the program 90 degrees and lifted it above ground. And that allowed the site to be accessible. And it created a space in the centre of the site. And we like to term this as both ceremonial and practical. So this approach became the foundation from which we've designed a universally accessible ground plan. So we also had around 4 metres of height difference through the site to be able to mitigate. And that allowed us to push the built form and the program to the street edges, which in itself was quite challenging, given that we had a whole series of planning setbacks that were something we did have to challenge. But we were convinced that this was the right approach to create that gathering space within. So when we run through the build-up of the project, the program stack and the way that we orchestrated and organised everything around this central open space becomes quite clear. So we have the ground plane, we have the connected superfloor that actually hovers above and really does set the geometry to organise all of the other buildings. There's the small timber frame building, and I say small, it's not actually that small. It's 6 stories. We've got the residential accommodation that Hayball collaborated with us on. We've got the School of Engineering and all of the industry partners within 2 connected wings of the building. And then overall, the massing really plays out to make this connected ecosystem of innovation. So the articulation of the massing then became all about how do we break that up in the city skyline, but also cognizant that it needed to relate to people at a scale at the street. So as a statement of intent at the gateway of the Parkville campus to the University of Melbourne, that external articulation of the building's deliberately broken down. And as I said, it's in discernible components where the space between each of the pieces signifies either an entrance to one of the buildings or a laneway connection through and into the site. And when we slice that building open, we can unveil the complexity of program within, and you can start to see the connectivity right through from the lower subterranean levels up through to the inhabited rooftops and green roofs. And when we look at the detail of the ground plan, those connections are even more legible. The central theme of that organising open space is really to bring people together and to give them a place that's connected to all the buildings, and it's inherently part of the university and also to Carlton. So this is a publicly accessible 24/7 area and space, and it is incredibly welcoming. And look, that's to emulate that conversation around innovation as a collaborative process. So with Aspect Studios, we've used timber and bricks in the ground plane and native planting in an effort to create a really robust place that's inviting. It's a great place to work outside with seating, tables, Wi-Fi and events coming up eventually when we're allowed to be back there in person. So the superfloor is that invited space. It's open to everybody who works in the building and who lives on this particular site. And it's a little bit like a hyper library where everything's connected. It's got a whole series of different types of spaces. And then moving up into the typical floor plates, as I said, the main building is split into 2 and we've got 2 different cores. As you can see, we've got a lot of facade area. So we'll get into what that actually means for us to start to tackle that particular design problem. But with that understanding of the context of the university campus and the urban grain of Carlton, we really looked to connect those 2 conditions, bring it through the site and quite literally connect everything. So when we work with Arup and the facade types, we had 4 key areas that we were looking at. So there's the podium, there's the superfloor serrated facade geometry, and I mentioned that's a really important organising feature of the whole precinct. There's the facade of the tower, and we also have the timber frame building. The ones I'd like to talk to you about today are the brickwork and the tower facades. So mainly talking about the collaborative nature of spaces, we might ask how we actually reassess what's going on in the public realm at a moment in time where we're not physically as connected as we'd like to be. But what we like to do is talk about how we have approached the design of the facades to, in future, hopefully, facilitate as much collaborative work to happen on site as possible. So we've come full circle, and what we wanted to do was connect what's going on outside to the inside. So we've really looked at a whole series of relevant materials in and around Carlton, and one of them that stands out is the brickwork. So in the podium, the materiality and the scale that's really predominant in these streetscapes is something that's inspired us. And so abstracted that scale and rhythm and created that human connection and the scale of the interface that's really then able to be saturated with the minutiae of brick detailing. So when we also play that out throughout the buildings and the connected nature of the city block that it sits in, we start to carve out the underside of the podium with the silhouette of the street. And the ability to pull those two things away is really what is where we put the superfloor. So that it really does become a connecting feature. So we've deliberately aimed to make the street-facing windows of the creator spaces and the science gallery and the superfloor with slightly more domestic overtones than you might expect in a building of this size. And we did that to indicate that the spaces are quite familiar and they're accessible, and you know, you can sit there and you can peek through the windows and see what's happening. And where there's something really going on, like a display, the Science Gallery Western exhibition space, for instance, we made the windows really big, and we did things like give people spaces to actually sit at and look through and see what's going on. In Swanston Street, we've used the brickwork podium and a massive brick portal to celebrate the entrance to the maker spaces and the fabrication laboratory. And we used a mix of the university grey bricks and the red bricks of Chapel Red, Burwood Blue, and we replicated the previous brickwork from the old hospital. So that mix and the pixelation, we really look to play up the idea of entrance. And we get these beautiful unexpected moments of shadow play, really celebrating life on the street. And then to sort of unpack how we actually made all of this work, we understanding and working with what we understand of traditional brickwork, we really had to turn it on its head and understand how to span all of these giant openings. So we ended up doing a series of prototyping with Arup and with Lend-Lease and with the Brickyard, with Burn Construction, with the amazingly rich dialogue about how to solve this issue. And the precast portals themselves are incredibly spectacular, quite oversized, and the scale of them and the installation of them, the construction was an absolutely fascinating process. And I'll play you a video now just to take you through that. So that was actually a short clip of the Science Gallery Melbourne entrance on Grattan Street. And what we actually did was, into the mix of all the pixelation and the portal and the amazing structural gymnastics, we, along with Arup and with the university and Science Gallery, we did an amazing workshop where we actually investigated a series of areas that we could insert some digital media into the architecture. And what eventuated was that the digital brickwork was the winner, if that's the right way to put it, in terms of the ability to capture content that the Science Gallery could actually display and harness and use and actually become slightly interactive. So the glass bricks that we used, we had some in the studio, and we had the Arup team come over on a Friday evening, and we tested out what these would actually look like with screens behind them. And we modelled up each and every of the bricks in the virtual world. We actually did some 3D printing to test it all out as well. And obviously we then took that to a series of documentation levels where we got to make a prototype out in the brickyard. And this is a very short video just looking at the different screens. We had a few to choose from, and the resolution up close, and some of the mortar options that we were looking at, some of the backgrounds and whether we turn the frog up or down, and really fascinating process. And the outcome has been incredibly spectacular, very successful. It just won a digital media in architecture award, and I invite you all to go down there and see it on your 5-kilometre walk at the moment. And there are 226 of these glass bricks, and the team actually came up with If These Walls Could Talk. And as I said, it's now a curated art piece, and the Science Gallery have really embraced this. My understanding is that they are developing some technology in the next couple of months to actually make the screens interactive with the upcoming exhibition. So as I said, they're curated, and the themes are all related to the Science Gallery. And that cross-disciplinary mix of science and art is really the important message, I guess, is what's happening through here as well, given that we can then inject the art into the architecture and the engineering. We studied quite a lot of different locations and configurations, and what we actually understood at the end of the day is that obviously the architecture is for the people, and we needed to study and make sure that everybody, no matter what size or vision impairment, you may be able to enjoy this. So we made it for small people, tall people, and people standing on others' shoulders. So we wanted to make sure that those moments of joy were available to as many people as possible. So with a lot of the collaborative focus being on the lower levels of the precinct, the upper levels of the tower above are a little bit more expressive of the sustainability aspirations for Melbourne Connect and for the precinct itself, and also for the research being undertaken within its walls. As I mentioned, there are a number of different initiatives that were targeted and have been achieved, and along with the Arup ESD team, Richard, Chris, and the rest of the team there, a lot of these initiatives were not just for design, they're actually being delivered as built. One of the initiatives you can see is the connection through the site, but also the fact that we've got PV cells populating the roofs as far as we could possibly manage. And the facades are also a really key part of the integrated approach that we took. So one of the briefing components was for 10% of all energy on site to be generated by renewables actually on site. So the PV cells play one part. There's some geothermal in through some of the soldier piles in the basements. But a really important and large part of achieving that has been the approach that we took to the facade design. So we wanted that really clear agenda to be able to reduce the amount of energy being absorbed through the glass and making them as expressive as possible of that intent, looking at a number of different ways of doing that. We actually did achieve that by creating a series of three-dimensional triangulated sunshading hoods. And look, we also brought into the mix a very similar geometric prism panel made of glass. So the results are really expressive, but it's entirely passive, a design for the facade that's sensitive to the orientation. As I mentioned previously, the buildings are 360 degrees. The cores are all absorbed within this beautiful facade. So we limited the solar exposure and the consideration of the really complex spatial demands within the buildings. The master plan itself obviously pushes all of that program and all of the built fabric to the site perimeter, and that internal geometry is mostly facing north. And so we had a series of north-facing solar challenges to overcome. And what we devised, again with the Arup team, and this actually arrived quite early in the design competition process, was to tailor each one of these sun shading hoods and the glass prisms to suit its specific location and orientation on all of the facades on all of the buildings. So the sun shading hoods are the ones doing the lion's share of the work on the north and the west facades, and the glass prisms are mixed into the west facade, and they create a really vibrant pattern of colour and relief that does provide that self-shading and assist us to achieve that 10% energy. And we investigated a series of different ways of looking at that mix and where the nodes are and how many sun shading hoods do we have and how many prisms do we have, and coupling that in with the context, proximities of other buildings, but also really importantly the views out from the floor plates, coupled with obviously the solar loading and where that was most needed. So we, with the team, our team and the Arup team, we looked at the best application of our environmental knowledge and the tools that we had at our sort of beck and call, but also ones that we didn't have, we developed. So there's scripts that were imagined and written for all of the panel types. We assessed a lot of things to address our brief, which were daylight, views obviously, and the program within. And then Arup would analyse and optimise the panel locations, and then through the construction process, we would collectively work through optimizing all of the quantities, the panel types, the node locations, and their locations. So it's a truly unique internal experience for the floor plates. The depth of the prison panels is about 450 mil, and that lean out moment is really quite something. So just going around the building, this is the east facing corner of Cardigan and Grattan Street. And you can start to see some of those colours. So the base really starts with a red to match the brickwork, and then we release that up and it becomes lighter every 2 floors, through to a very light ochre colour with the champagne of the sun shading hoods on the outside being consistent, and we pick up the coloration on the inside of the sun shading hoods. So it's an incredibly rich expression of performance generated facade design. It's ever changing. The shadows, the reflections are really quite spectacular through the day and through the year. And you can start to see some of those colorations on the inside of the sun shading hoods coming through there. So with that cross-pollination of program and disciplines within Melbourne Connect, we really wanted to make sure that what we were putting forward into Carlton, into the university, was as expressive as it could be, that it did have that excitement and that energy that's happening on the facades, reflected of what's happening inside the buildings itself. So the mass, the colour, the texture, the materiality changes, the facades. It's really exciting for us to think about this place as a new connecting and collaborative precinct in Melbourne. So there's a few of the line notes here just about the building, and we can talk about those a little bit further with Tim, but I'll just leave you with this short video. And thanks very much for listening. We'll hand over to Tim right now, and I hope you've enjoyed this little insight to Melbourne Connect. Thanks.
Thank you, Hazel, for your insights. Wow, what an amazing presentation. This will be followed up by our second speaker, Chris Hube. Chris joins us from Arup and is motivated and a built environment professional, educated in architecture and building science. He's got a real passion towards building envelope building physics and has a postgraduate studies in energy and environment, and has a real knack for relating and leading people to achieve their business objectives and his clients' goals. Chris is highly experienced in leading multidisciplinary teams, particularly around ESD, wind, daylight, acoustics, theatre, facade engineering, access and material. And and has a real knack across a whole range of projects, whether they be arts and culture projects, commercial projects, residential, hospitality, healthcare, science, and technology. Chris currently leads the facade engineering team for Victoria at Arup and has about 10 people in his team. And he is the facade engineering design leader for the AAW, which is the Arup Arcadis WSP JV, for the Melbourne Tunnel project, the Melbourne Metro Tunnel project, which is a big major mega project here in Victoria. There's approximately 30 people in that team across 9 cities and 7 countries. Please join me in welcoming Chris Hube.
Thanks, Tim, for the introduction. Hi, I'm Chris Hube. I'm the facade engineering leader in Victoria for Arup. I've worked in the built environment industry and specifically around facades for over 15 years. I come to you with a wealth of experience on different projects from around the world, but today my presentation is going to be lifting the curtain, or curtain wall, you might say, and looking behind the facade and talking a little bit more around the kind of our approach to the Melbourne Connect project and working with Hazel and the wider design and client team. Facades come in all different shapes and sizes, and it's really hard to just apply one approach to it. Some facades are unique or new in their form, some are a renewal, some require some trials and tribulations to get to the final outcome. Some are innovative materials that are achieving multiple functions, like sun shading. Some have different appearances from 2 different perspectives, as the bystander walking by the building or the user inside. Some we look at from new materials altogether, or materials that have a greater longevity, that must stand the test of time, but be moldable to a particular shape. Or older materials that we're trying to do something new with. And in some cases, we look at all the modern techniques to achieve color or form, but in some cases, modern facades actually employ traditional techniques, like load-bearing masonry, a vocation that's almost lost in some industries. But facades aren't new. Curtain walls aren't new. They've been around since the 1950s and earlier. But what I think is really important is that when we approach best practice in innovation, it's always a reminder that facade engineering isn't just a discipline. It's a culmination of all disciplines, and many of them, and require a really kind of conscious decision to want to work together. And I'm always reminded, and I think it's always a good thing, that we kind of go back to what is the base route that we're trying to look at. And at Arup, we have the concept of total architecture. And the premise is that, from a single discipline perspective, it's not always as simple as just jumping in and, answering that question on how to enclose a building to separate the outside from inside. There's a holistic approach we need to employ to make sure we get the right answer or the right solution. And we need to work together to get to that outcome. So last year I presented on what the building envelope is, and I think it's really important that a facade is just a component of it, or the vertical component of a building isn't just the only aspect that actually creates the enclosure. And we need to think with the building envelope in mind. And those building envelope drivers are almost endless to an extent. There are so many things that are influencing the key decisions we make. But where did we start on Melbourne Connect? And Hazel's done a great introduction and showed the experience that her and her team has gone through and that we worked with her on. And we had to look at, the precinct and the building as a whole and how it worked together. And so we had to start with a commitment. We had to together agree that we had to focus on what was best for the project. It had to be a collaboration between ourselves, Woods Bagot, Lendlease, the university. It had to be teamwork. It wasn't going to just be myself. It wasn't just going to be myself and just a junior helping me out. This was a full team effort from all different aspects and specialisms. We had to commit to doing something special, something a bit different. And we had to agree that we wanted to do better than less bad. And when I mean less bad, I'm referring to just minimum code compliance. We had to do better than that if we're going to make an innovative precinct like the Melbourne Connect. So a starting point that is always kind of fresh in mind, and we need to really focus on what the sustainable outcomes we want. The UN SDGs is a good framework for that starting point, and really targeting what the project can offer and do better at than just the minimum standard. That's just what we did on Melbourne Connect. Our ESD team really focused on how these collection of buildings that had commercial usage, accommodation, childcare, assembly, galleries, all work together as a harmonious element. And we need to really consider, how we reduce the amount of resources consumed, energy used, maximize the well-being with daylight and views were all important aspects. With facades, we always start with ensuring that the facade is high performing. And this is really important to the sustainability story. If the facade is high performing, energy efficient, mitigating solar heat gains, then we can aim to reduce the amount of energy needed for mechanical and services. We can maximize the on-site renewables to further reduce the overall and contribute to the overall energy consumption of the building. So we had to start with this high-performing facade in mind. And then we had to look at the site, and it had to be site-specific. I've shown this diagram, I think, before with the aspects of the site. To the north, we had the dental hospital. East and west, we had low-lying sun. We had the beautiful views of the city to the south. We want to mitigate solar heat gains, so we didn't have to cool the environment as much. We had to make sure that the envelope was high, very high thermal performing. We wanted views and access to daylight, which is kind of counter to shading. And we had to find that fine balance. So with our approach to this innovative building and this innovative facade, I had to look at an alternative technique. We had to use the empirical data that we've done on past projects to develop a rapid digital prototyping approach. We had to look at optimizing this facade and balancing the different aspects. We had to consider the flexibility for the architecture to play with and to kind of end up on a final scheme that was palatable, that they could pull together and actually had applied to the narrative of the building and the eventual outcomes. We had to set actually some parameters. Some things were fixed. We couldn't project the sunshades out beyond a certain distance from the facade. We had to ensure that we weren't just covering the whole glass with solid shading, because then there's no views. So by coming with this optimized approach, we employed a simple technique to determine what were the minimum parameters we wanted to constrain it to. Then we had to look at what were the different modeling techniques. And we used a Rhino and Grasshopper plugin and pulled together a bit of scripting to then be able to model this and actually run a number of iterations to get to an ultimate or optimized solution. You can see here we actually at least did 370 options through this. And then we'll be able to narrow it down to kind of a few numbers that we're able to give us a short list of approaches. Once we had the base intent, we actually delved it down into two kind of sunshade approaches. We had a prism, which you can see on the left there, that employed 4 different planes in a kind of prism shape off of a rectilinear framing. And then we had a sun hood system that was a separate attachment in front of the glass. All of this was in a relatively kind of standardized, thermally broken curtain wall system. And it was really important that we actually found and employed a standardized framing approach to ensure that the building envelope actually connected together, could be procured and shipped from overseas or built locally, and to ensure that we actually could meet or kind of procure it from local trades. So it actually was a system that was familiar to them without imposing too much risk. Once we had kind of set those premises and those kind of rules, we were able to then apply them with Woods Bagot to the different elevations. So the west elevation, you can see we have sunshades and we have prisms. We had flat glass, and they were all kind of purposeful. So the sunshades are a bit more on the gray tone elements there. You can see a little bit more of a shading on the glass behind. And then you can see the prisms actually had employed a little bit of color to differentiate them. And on the inside of the shades, it was almost a mirror of the prisms, and the color was also shown there from the user or occupant's perspective as they looked out. Still a reasonable amount of views, and a nice amount of daylight coming there on that floor plate, but also shading that really harsh late afternoon sun. On the east was very similar. You can actually see that the direction of the sunshades are very different here. You have the pure east elevation, which is on the left-hand side, and then you have this elevation that's slightly angled towards the northeast. Slightly different exposures, dealing with different aspects of the sun. You can also see just on the edge between the last set of sunshades and then the golden bronzy building on the left, the student accommodation, those sunshades start to dwindle out. And that was purposeful because the student accommodation actually overshadows that portion of the facade. So it wasn't necessary to employ any additional shading or solar mitigation techniques. So we allowed that to be just standard glass. You can see it here just a little bit more up close, just the slight differentiation between the sunshades and the prisms. And the north elevation was employed all sunshades to it. And that was a deliberate approach that Hazel and her team employed. The critical thing with this one, as we worked through the detail design, was actually this curved facade. There was a little bit of concern that we had in reflected solar glare. And that solar glare potentially culminating into a very focused position and maybe having an excess temperatures that might actually be harmful to the plant life in the landscaping below. So in the similar idea of the rapid prototyping, we use that kind of similar modeling in a slightly different approach to look at that solar radiation and that reflected glare, just to optimize those sunshades a little bit more to avoid that from occurring. As we came down the building and focused on another portion of the building envelope, we came into the brickwork on the podium. At this time, as we're a reasonable way through the design development, the university came to us with an idea. They wanted to digitally activate the facade. So everything I've shown today, when it's built, is static. the architecture, the shading, it's all there permanently. It doesn't move. There's no interaction. And the client wanted to add an element of digital and an activation to it. And we were all sitting there kind of going, what does this mean? How can we achieve this? Where do we start? And we're kind of thinking, digital activation, are we just throwing lights on it? Is there something a bit more purposeful? And like all digital things, you kind of want to jump into a digital environment. Well, we actually started from an analog approach. We had to get people together. We had to employ the ideas of what's important if we're going to activate this facade. Why are we doing it? We needed to really understand that purpose. I talked about earlier with the facade on the upper portion of the building. We started with the purpose of sun shading and optimizing views. Those were a little bit more norm. That's a standard approach when we're dealing with kind of larger portions of buildings. But here was wanting to be something very different, and we didn't know what that was. So it had to go through an exploration. We really needed to kind of pull it apart and bring it back together what the purpose was we were doing this for. So we pulled together precedent images, what are the key statements we're looking for? What do we want it to be? We had to look at and explore, who's this for? Why are we doing this at all? Where can we do it? So we explored different ideas. We call them canvases that we could activate. Is it the podium? Is it the soffits of the canopies and undercross? Is it the main facade with all the shading on it? Or is it the negatives between those? Or is it the very top of the building, the plant level that is not usually seen or celebrated? Maybe we use it as a beacon of sorts, kind of like 1-on-1 columns and the spires there that are with their lighting. Who are we connecting with? Is this a connection to the city? Or are we connecting a little bit more with the people? And these are all things we had to go through a multiple workshop with all the key stakeholders from the University of Melbourne, so academics, the property, the operators, the developer, the builder, all the design teams, so from architecture to engineering, and really kind of get to the heart and really think about where we're going, where we want to be. And we kind of delved it down, our purpose, into kind of three aspects. We want to light a canvas. We want that to be interactive. We want this kind of day and night juxtaposition. We had content, and we weren't sure what that content was yet, but it had to be flexible. So content being, are we just lighting it in a digital artistic way? Are we presenting data, PhD information? Are we allowing students to develop it on their own? Are we actually showing maybe how much renewable energy we're generating on site? That content wasn't known, but it wanted to be flexible. If there's going to be an innovation precinct, it had to enable anything to occur in that. And there had to be an interaction. And the interaction was really important because interaction had to show to the world, in whatever case. It could be through Instagram, it could be a person walking by, it could be a user, what was happening or what could be happening. Had to be able to tell a story. So we worked through these a little bit more, and we start to actually take it to employ this kind of innovation, we had to look at the user. If it was truly going to be something that had clear purpose and be successful, the user had to be front of mind. So that interaction point was the key aspect, and then we kind of applied it throughout. So we're looking at the soffits. How do you interact with it? How does that work? What does that look like? If we do the negatives in the upper part of the building, it's a bit more outward facing, a view from afar. Is that as interactive as we want it to be? Is that just limiting to a smaller portion of the users or passerbys? Or if we focused on the podium, not as much city facing. So it's probably not a beacon towards the city that, hey, come look at us, come find our building, but a little bit more intimate to the people below. And actually, this idea that at the ground level, the building was alive. The building had something else to add. You didn't just drive by it on your bike. You didn't just walk through it to get to a class or a collaboration space. You could sit there and have a moment. And that's where it came about. But the interesting thing of all, after looking at all these options, is this one was probably the most innovative in the sense it hadn't been done before in this way. It had a really good day and night interaction, an ability that during the day actually it was usable and interactive, but at night as well. Had the most risk from a procurement, had never been done. Fabrication, not sure how to employ this. Supply and design, we had to throw the rule book out the door and really start from square one, and it needed a lot of research and development. And the only way that we could really do that, in a very similar manner to the upper facade, was to sample, test, and prototype. We had to prototype this. We had to kind of roll up our sleeves and get a little dirty. But again, we're endeavoring for a digital outcome, but we had to do this physically because these materials were so different. So what we decided is if the walls could talk, had to look at embedding glass bricks into an existing clay brick facade or a designed facade, illuminate them with an element. Here we are actually playing with some of the brick samples and looking at the different colors of bricks. Some were a bit more bronze, some were clear, some were frosted, some were polished. And here we're actually playing with it in a boardroom with iPhones behind them and testing to see what the characteristics were like. And like all digital environments, the ultimate test was, can a cat video work on it? How does that light transmission work? What's the image clarity? How does it look with a standard off form glass brick versus a polished brick? Are we able to tell a story through here? Or what level of story? Is it a low resolution story? So maybe a little bit more binary, like just a bunch of lights? Or could we actually employ digital imagery in a really fine detail behind these bricks as individual screens? Or could they become more? Could we connect them together? These are all things we had to trial out. We went through more physical mock-ups. How do we look at these two different materials? We have a clay-fired brick. We have a glass brick. One's porous, one's not. Both are really good in compression, so that's great. Then that's kind of very similar to how blockwork or masonry works. But how do they deal with, over time? Brickwork tends to grow over time with a bit of moisture exposure, because it's a porous material, it tends to grow a little bit. Not huge amounts, but when you actually are stacking them very tall, then you start to see millimeters, centimeters of movement. Well, you have a glass brick that actually doesn't grow. It doesn't really expand as much as the clay brick. So if we start to put these glass bricks into the facade, are they going to rip themselves apart? How do we prevent that from happening? Where do we actually add them? Do we add them everywhere? Do we have big clusters? Do we have a few little? These are all things we had to go through. So the next step had to be, we have to try to build it. We have to try to employ all these thoughts of minimizing the amount of movement, putting the right minimum cluster of glass bricks that didn't also have that large growth that they would kind of break apart. We had to look at what's the mortar that holds them together. Is this kind of more traditional modern mortar that's a bit hard? Or do we have to soften it to actually allow for those minor movements to occur? We also had to look at what's the digital technology behind it. There was nothing in the market that fit behind there. There's nothing in the market that had a high enough resolution that we really wanted. There's nothing in the market that actually was outdoor rated, because behind the brickwork, yes, it's fairly protected from the rain, weather, but it's still in a pseudo outdoor environment. So it had to be an outdoor rated system. All of these weren't things that existed before. We had to go through these step by step. And this one-to-one mock-up was really the key aspect in the kind of, at this point, we were deciding, are we going to go ahead with this or are we not? So the glass brick suppliers were there. The brick contractor that was doing the podium elsewhere was there. We worked together to figure out, do we reinforce it? How do we secure it? How do we keep it in place? How do we look at the housing for the digital screens behind? How do we access it? How much room do we need for the wiring? Because the precast was about to be ordered and put on site. And that was like 12 months before we were actually going to get this brickwork on there. All of these things had so many different decisions that we had to make quick, but we didn't have, past experience or empirical evidence to do it. We had to actually pull it together. And when you look at it on the final building, I think this just, the success of this is because of this process, because we played with it. We had to do it physically. It's a digital outcome with a very analog, hands-on approach. The screens are inclusive. So Hazel and her team worked really carefully to look at, who can interact with it. Is it children? Is it people with disability? Is it tall people? Like, is it adults? All of this had to be there. And so this actually lower level location really employed that. And also it had to have that ability to be individual or a holistic screen. And going back to, our original commitments of collaboration and teamwork, like this is just some of the team that were, that made this thing entirely successful. And without having, lighting specialists, our AV specialists, facades, architecture, the digital screen suppliers and fabricators, the brick specialists, the glass supplier, we wouldn't have got this through. And we also wouldn't have got this through without the commitment of our client. The University of Melbourne and the Science Gallery both were on board with this. So, like, we're willing to go on this journey with you. And by agreeing with that and actually kind of laying that out, we could see the light. And this is how we got to the end. It's just lovely to see that you have this day and night interaction, and it's at small scale, it's at larger scale, and you can cross the road and you can still see it. It's something there that's, from all aspects, somebody can relate to or interact with. This image I just love, the culmination of the taller portions of the building that we put a lot of effort into digital prototyping, to the actual individual nature of a single brick showing a really innovative digital approach. So thank you for listening to me and for letting me share my story and to contribute to Hazel's approach. I'm going to pass it now on to Tim, and I look forward to the question and answer session and to answer anything that questions you guys might have. So thank you very much again.
Thanks for that, Chris. That was a great presentation. And I especially liked your comment about if the building could talk or if you had a moment with the building. Geez, I tell you what, it would be a slow trip to work, I think, if you could have a moment with every building, particularly in this day and age. Our speakers, both Hazel and Chris, will come together now to take some questions. And I thank all of you that have submitted questions as part of your engagement for this, but there is still time. Please ensure that you put your name and who the question is ideally directed at. And we'll start with some of the registration questions to kick off. Naomi from Victoria, Chris, this is to you, has a question about design life and objectives around maintenance and refurbishment. And I note a lot of people on the chat line have been talking about dust and servicing that facading element. I'd be keen to hear from you on how that part has been considered in the design beyond just looking pretty.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Naomi, for your question. That is actually one of the key components of which we actually start from. Setting the design life is really important to ensuring what quality we get. It sets the longevity, tries to reduce the amount of wastage over the life of a building, and ensures the client that we're actually going with the right tier of supplier, material, product, whatever it might be. I think another thing to keep in mind with the design life is that the longer a material can last, we're actually reducing its overall embodied impact. So when we look at carbon accounting now in materials, which is becoming more and more important as we improve the efficiency of buildings, by having materials with a longer lifespan actually reduces the amount of times we need to put them into waste or into recycling. They can actually sit there and last. So then the next component, as you say, maintenance, we've taken that into account in so many different ways. The way the sunshades are that Hazel was talking about that are so important to the performance. We can pull those off and replace the glass. We can actually leave those sunshades on the building and clean inside with the glass. We actually measured off the offset, and that was very purposeful to ensure that could occur. And all from the actual safe use of a BMU, building maintenance unit, from the roof level. So it is something we can take into consideration in everything we do, and as part of the kind of step back and assessment as we go through different milestones of the project.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Chris. And I suspect there's been some really healthy conversations with the FM as part of the Melbourne Connect project and on design responses that you've just articulated. You did bring up the conversation about the environment and sustainability, and I sort of want to direct this to you, Hazel. Polo from Victoria, upon registration, asked a question about the environmental performance of the building. I know you covered a little bit in your presentation, but if you could just expand a little bit on that. And then, Chris, I'll cut to you just on another similar question about energy efficiency, and particularly probably on that upper facading element. It would be good to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and look, thanks for your question, Paolo. As I mapped out a little bit in the presentation, just in terms of that 10% renewable energy target for being generated on site. So the balance that we struck with the facade and its ability to mitigate a lot of the solar heat gain obviously meant that the impost that we were putting onto that 10% was coming down. So the ability for that to really contribute, really make a really big impact on that number, that was our brief from the outset. So we really had that in the forefront of our minds. So the bricks less so. Look, they as much as we could possibly have the least embodied energy, we had them Australian manufactured. Obviously, Brickworks were a really big collaborator in what we were doing there. They had another story to tell, and there are a number of different ways that the building's actually being monitored to start to understand the success of those facade strategies that we employed. So there's, I think, a lot of the intel is to come. So watch this space, but we're really excited for the building to evolve and sort of have that life, and for places like the Science Gallery to actually harness some of that data and to make that part of their exhibitions as well. And obviously the university and School of Engineering are doing a lot to facilitate a lot of that collection of data.
So the next question was about energy efficient criteria. I think it was from Amit Kumar from ACT. So thanks for the question. I guess when you look at the building envelope or the facade aspect of it, we need to contribute to the whole story, like I was saying. But when you kind of bring it down into a few of the key components, like from a facade, it's the thermal efficiency. So how well does it keep the cool in or the heat out? Um, air tightness, how much leakage is there? Some cases we want leakage, in other cases we don't. In this case, for all of the projects on this site, we actually were pushing for really tight air tightness, which is a little bit more than what kind of typical or even some of the higher performing buildings have been in Melbourne. And shading, obviously. We want to mitigate solar heat gains where we can and maybe actually allow some heat gains in winter when you have the low lying sun, which are beneficial. But overall, I think the key thing, matching the performance of the building envelope plus the on-site renewables, the efficiency of the mechanical systems and equipment, we really were striving for 40-50% reduction in the operational energy. And that's a really big target. And we're really fortunate that we had a client that was willing to push that. And from the University of Melbourne, we had Lendlease that were on board with that as well to ensure that happened. And so every millimeter of that roof, our ESD team was calculating to ensure we maximize the right layout. They actually came up with like an optimized script to ensure that we could get them all laid out on the right angles, maintenance allowed for around them. So we had safety, but we also had as much PV to hit that 10% target.
Great comment. And, more and more these scripts are, I would say, doing the heavy lifting of good design decisions like you've just highlighted there, Chris. I want to just divert the conversation a little bit to, I would say, a legislative conversation down in Victoria, and I would say just across the world. There's been obviously a lot of focus towards combustible materials. Thomas in New South Wales has raised a question about the reduction or mitigation of some of those materials and aluminium facading. Hazel, have you, that might have actually changed halfway through the project. Do you want to walk us through what occurred with the ACPs and the combustible materials and what's occurred in the design response?
Yeah, and thanks for the question, Thomas. It's something that's actually been on the table from the outset. The university had the foresight to actually put that into the brief that absolutely no combustibles would be entertained. And there were a number of different materials that they also weren't willing to have because it wasn't part of the university's suite, and they weren't necessarily materials that would stand the test of time. And we all know what universities are, and how they need to be there, and that they have been there for a long time. So at Woods Bagot, we mandate we don't use any of the combustible. The sandwich panels. So that's something that we've done a hugely rigorous audit through our whole business, and I imagine there's a lot of other businesses that have done the same. So that's definitely not something that we design with. And look, what we did do is we actually made a timber building on site. So the antithesis of what we understand as being combustible, timber is that. But what the CLT and GLT building actually offered was a really amazing learning experience for our team and for Lendlease to go through the process of getting the fire engineering certified and passed. And you'll probably all be familiar with the fact that it has a charring resistance, and it has a certain self-protectiveness to it. So combustibles definitely on everybody's radars, but the university, they anticipated that, and we never really had to have that conversation.
Good. It's a conversation you definitely don't want to have, that's for sure. Particularly in front of a jury or a court, that's for sure. Albert and Matthew on the chat have both raised conversations about, I guess, the structural integrity of some of those glass bricks and some of those facading elements. Matthew had a bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment about tradie protests and I guess their resistance to those kind of unforeseen events. Chris, have you got a view or did you test some of the structural properties of the bricks, and can you share some of those insights that you went through as part of testing?
Yeah, of course. I think I mentioned there about having to actually assess the materiality of the two types of bricks. What is their material compositions and characteristics? Compression strength was one of them. Surprisingly, the glass bricks have more compression strength than clay bricks in some cases. But glass has always been really good in compression. It's a remarkable material. And we had to take that into consideration. Because if it couldn't stand up on its own right, then it wasn't an appropriate use of material to achieve what we wanted. I guess to the other point about, glass is brittle, a little bit more brittle than brick in some extents. But when you look at the glass brick, because it's more solid compared to the panes of glass in a window, which is quite thin, it does have a certain more resilience to it. So what we found is actually in the prototyping, there was a brick that had been dropped on its edge. It had a little chip out of it, or a shelling, which we kind of refer to. Um, you know, it was okay. It was still intact. It wasn't shattered altogether. It wasn't cut through. So the bricks have a little bit more resilience to impacts than, say, your windows next to it. So if somebody really wanted to go at it with a sledgehammer, they'd be damaging the clay brick adjacent to it as well. So what we did, though, consider is when we talked about in the prototyping process is that, let's say that a glass brick is shattered for whatever reason, could we replace it and allow that to happen? If you look at the stack bond approach that Hazel and her team came up with, there was different ways we could allow that, and because we were working with the brick contractor, they were part of the extended design team, prototyping it. We discussed that kind of methodology with them, and that was incorporated in our thinking.
Thanks so much, Chris, and great answer. I know you did cover it, but good to go into slightly more detail. Hazel, over to you. Adam's asked a question about the facade over the Rio concrete. And interestingly, his comment is that the facading element, despite having the look at me bricks, has a sort of humbleness to it. Was that sort of part of the conversations early days?
Yeah, and look, again, thanks for the sort of comment statement. Yes, a good pickup. It was something that was definitely driven out of context. Carlton, understanding that there's a lot of brickwork, and particularly at that particular that streetscape scale, with the windows, with the way that the brickwork detailing is available to us, and using that as a bit of an inspiration. So the fun factor was definitely high on our list of priorities. And again, having opportunities to bring in some of the history of the site. We did test all of the brickwork that was partly salvaged out of the hospital, and it was stress tested. It was sent over to Adelaide, a couple of pallets, and then unfortunately was deemed not quite worthy to be part of the structural wall. So the actual bricks ended up in the paving in the oculus. And what we did was replicate the colour in the podium. So everything in the podium, bar the actual portals, are load-bearing brickwork, and they have steel within the cavity. So it's a reasonably traditional approach to everything except for that quite heroic portal. There's two of them, actually. Just because the scale of them, we did try with great gusto, working with John in the brickwork team with Burns, trying to corbel it and then tie it back with steelwork, and then corbel it and tie it back, and it was just getting too heavy and cumbersome. And the precast actually almost resolved itself as a way of solving that. So we had a lot of fun resolving how to do that, but it's also the fun factor in the design that actually eventuated from that, and it's that unexpected moment that we really did we want to achieve with our team. Yeah.
Great, Hazel. And along the same thread, and a good conversation, I guess, from Albert and Daniel about renewables. Albert, I guess, raising up the solar PV, and Daniel raising up the conversation about micro wind generators. Are a lot of your clients bringing this to you, and how are you incorporating this within your workflows now? It's a bit of an open question to both of you, but increasingly, I would say this is a a part of building design now and making sure that it's integrated in any facet. I'd be keen to hear more about that workflow and how it's changing over time.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and most our clients that is one of their really important agendas. It's not just for the building; it's for their business, it's for their people, it's for the people who are occupying the building. So, sustainability has a number of different facets. It's not just from day one when we deliver the building and it's handed over. It's about how it's operated. It's about how it has longevity in the world that it's created into. So that's all part of its sustainability. We often are absolutely aligned with what our clients want, and they sometimes have ideas and aspirations that we haven't done. So, like I said, the CLT and the GLT building in Melbourne Connect was the first one for the Melbourne team here, and we really rose to the challenge with Lendlease to bring that one to fruition. So, sustainability is absolutely the agenda. It's not just the new kid in town. It's here to stay, and it's something that Woods Bagot absolutely drives through each and every one of our design projects.
Maybe I'll just bounce on the back of that. Is that with the on-site renewables, it is going to be more and more important as we head towards net zero and regenerative design. So at the very early stages, I said, better than less bad. Like, we were really striving to push it as much as we could and to be net positive if we could get there. But it as Hazel said, it was starting in 2016. We had to look at the holistic precinct. There wasn't certain commitments we could ensure that we could meet, but we were striving to be there. And really what we're looking for with net positive design now is it's all electric. We're removing any fossil fuel on site, generators, gas for cooking, etc. So by having the on-site renewables, you're offsetting that immediately on site rather than relying on green power and we don't, there is an agenda there to make all of our power network green, but we're not there yet. So we still have some fossil fuels in that mix. So we really need to, it needs to be part of the design. It needs to be a focus, and we can consider it in so many different ways. So we talked about the roof on Carlton Connect. There are always opportunities to incorporate it into the vertical aspects, but it really depends on the building. Sometimes buildings are hugely overshadowed, so the vertical aspect actually isn't very effective. So we look at other ways, and that's where we maybe focus on the thermal performance or something like that.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I guess that unit of energy that can stay behind the meter, both on supply and consumption, is absolutely important. And that area of town does get quite windy, so the turbines are probably not a bad idea too. Hazel, I think it's probably more for you, but Chris, feel free to jump in. There's been a couple of questions, Daniel, Ned, around costs. Now, obviously, there's conversations beyond capital costs, and like a lot of the heavy lifting has gone into sustainability, and some of the efforts there probably will likely pay fruition into the long-term life cycle of the assets cost. But obviously not an open checkbook from the university, but have you got an idea of or a sense of where this building landed in terms of capital costs and whole of life costs? Be keen to sort of get a bit of a ballpark on what that sort of stress testing
look,
did.
guys. It's
sensitivity
a question
testing
that we often encounter, and sometimes it's a little difficult for us to answer. There's a whole stream of things that run through a project in its lifetime that come out on balance, and they're not always visible to the architecture and design team. We definitely had a budget that we were working towards, and we had a value management process as well that we actually turned into a design process. I should probably put it more succinctly. We were fortunate enough to have Lendlease Building and Development with us for that whole journey. So there was never a point in time that we weren't aware of either being over or under the budget, and being able to make what we were proposing work for both our clients through that process. I don't have a number to give you at this point in time. And look, even if I did, it would be a guess because, as I said, there's a number of things that go into a building of this size, and there's a number of different buckets of money where all of the budget ends up coming from. So I dare say that some post-occupancy and some numbers and going through what has actually eventuated probably will make its way out into the world at some point. And look, there might be some numbers associated with that, but I think the value obviously is in the way that the people are actually able to enjoy it.
Yeah, good point. And what's having a moment worth really in terms of dollars? If everyone walks past and has a moment with a building, that's what I pose to you, Ned and Daniel. I'm very conscious of the time, and obviously conscious of people's time watching, and Hazel and Chris, for you too. I've got a bit of a personal question, and it sort of dovetails nicely into John's question from registration, with a view towards the Southeast Queensland Olympics. And my question, very similar to his, is what would you do differently next time? And with a view that some of those learnings for next time would absolutely be fed forward to other inspirational buildings and assets in the built environment up north. Hazel.
Yeah, look, Melbourne, Brisbane, vastly different in terms of their climate, but probably amazing similarities in the way that people use civic space and use places of gathering and, the opportunity to come together and the way that buildings can facilitate all of those things. So I imagine in Brisbane there's a series of projects that have come online that are more centred around sport, but they're always centred around bringing people together. So those lessons around what we were dealing with in terms of creating spaces for that, obviously that's a really big one. The sun shading aspect, I would absolutely say is a massive lesson that we've undertaken with Woods Bagot and Arup as well, understanding how we use scripting and parametric tools to really go in and analyse the context, the conditions year round. That made a huge difference to the way we approach Melbourne Connect. So one of those lessons, it also expedites a lot of testing for us. It enabled us to look at a number of different design solutions, work it through with the client, understand where the tipping point and the balance actually landed with cost and constructability, lead times, maintenance, all of the things that go into making good, robust design decisions. That was definitely something that we got a lot out of this project.
I think the other thing that that we do a lot of, and we used it particularly in the brick one, was actually putting ourselves in the user's shoes. So who is the user when is a really important thing. Say with the Olympics in mind, a lot of it has talked about legacy. What's the legacy of whatever we're building in these environments? Does it just need to be temporary, or does it need to be permanent? Because there can be a lot of waste that can occur, and we want to avoid that. The other thing is, if we think about the community, is it benefiting the community, or is it actually just purposeful for the Olympics when it's happening? Can it be both? Like, does it have a transition from Olympic use to permanent use? Are all really key things. And if it doesn't need to be there for a long period of time, then let's not make it to do that, and let's use materials that are appropriate that can be reused in the future. If it is going to be there for a long time, well, let's consider back to that design life perspective. It's got a purpose. We're ensuring that it can last the test of time through the different exposures and different users. And then those designs holistically, whatever geometry they are, whatever kind of flair they might be, style, that will all come out. But if the user's got a bit of focus to it, it's probably going to have a more better lifetime than just kind of thinking about it in one lens.
Thanks, Chris. And that really rounds out today's session. And thank you to both of you, and thank you to those that have been watching. It's been a really inspiring presentation from both you and project just in general. So yeah, join me again in thanking both Hazel Porter from Woodsburgot and Chris Hube from Arup for both their time and insights today, as well as those for the Southeast Queensland Olympics in a decade's time. I'd also like to extend my thanks to EA and Austral Bricks for making today's webinar possible. For more series, have a look to the right. There's more webinars that are very similar with a wide range of topics. And we'd also appreciate your feedback on today's program, and that really helps us to improve and plan future sessions. And there's a short feedback form in the description box below. Thanks again for joining us, and have a good evening. And we hope to see you at our next webinar with Engineers Australia.